It's 10 o'clock. This is Sky News at 10, live from Jerusalem, as Israel's leader rejects any chance of a ceasefire. The fear in Gaza, now a territory effectively cut in two as Israel's tanks and forces move in on its central city. The family celebrating the return of a soldier rescued from Hamas, but other hostages are filmed in captivity. And amid the killing in Gaza, we hear an appeal for escape from the family of a British teacher pleading for the border to be opened.
My biggest fear is that they're going to get hurt or injured or worse.
Also on Sky News at 10 tonight, a terrible, tragic joke. The criticism of the COVID response from the very top levels of government as the families of the victims prepare to hear the evidence of Boris Johnson's controversial chief of staff.
Your Majesty King Charles, in your visit to Kenya, I extend my heartfelt invitation to meet us, the family of Agnes Wanjiru.
A mother's murder and an appeal for intervention by the King as the monarch arrives in Kenya for his first African visit. Move over Babette, Kieran's on its way. The warning over what could be a nasty winter storm bringing new flooding and reaching the UK this week. And we'll take a first look at tomorrow's front pages in our press preview from 10:30 right through to midnight.
Good evening from Jerusalem. Israel's Prime Minister said tonight that this is a time for war as he rejected any possibility of a ceasefire. Benjamin Netanyahu was speaking as his forces moved further into Gaza. The Israeli military said its soldiers had rescued one of their own from Hamas detention, but the families of 3 more hostages were forced to see their loved ones appear in a video filmed by Hamas. Much of the military action since Israeli troops entered Gaza late last week has been focused on the north, where Israel warned Gazans to evacuate. Israeli forces have entered at multiple points, with the Institute for the Study of War reporting clearing operations in the areas shown in purple in the far north of the territory. But today, Sky News has also verified footage of an IDF tank firing at a car on the Salah al-Din main road, which connects the north and south. There are also increasing concerns about hospitals being targeted. All the hospitals operating in northern Gaza have received evacuation orders from Israel. That's according to the UN's Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, including Al-Shifa and Al-Quds Hospital. Later we'll hear an appeal from one British citizen trapped on the ground in Gaza. But first this evening, our chief correspondent Stuart Ramsey's report on the Israeli advance, and a warning here. It includes pictures of that moment a tank opens fire on a car.
Deep inside Gaza now, Israeli troops taking over houses and planning movements. Outside, these Israeli Defense Force pictures showed tanks and armoured personnel carriers manoeuvring through Gaza. This is a proper invasion and bombing campaign that appears to be growing by the day. The Israeli government wants this to be seen home and abroad. But there are pictures less likely to be approved by the IDF as its campaign continues. This terrifying video is captured by a Gaza journalist on the main road heading south from Gaza City. The car ahead hasn't seen there is a tank on the right. The journalists film as the car suddenly attempts to turn. The tank fires. The journalists say an entire family was killed. In a panic, they rush to get away. Other cars are travelling towards the tank. They lean out of the car, shouting for everyone to turn back. There is the sound of another tank round. Some stop, others do not. The road south is now blocked. The Israeli Prime Minister says there will be no let-up.
Calls for a ceasefire are calls for Israel to surrender to Hamas, to surrender to terrorism, to surrender to barbarism. That will not happen. Ladies and gentlemen, the Bible says that there is a time for peace and a time for war. This is a time for war.
The aerial onslaught on Gaza is quite staggering in its intensity. IDF video shows building after building being destroyed. And eyewitnesses have told Sky News that the north is now cut off from the relative safety of the south. By splitting Gaza in half, the Israeli Defense Forces can now focus their attention exclusively on the Hamas positions in the north, in Gaza City, and of course the tunnels beneath the city. But this manoeuvre does raise questions about the safety of civilians, thousands of whom have stayed behind or have even returned. Hundreds of thousands have moved south, many to the city of Khan Yunis. It has been attacked, but it's in better shape than towns to the north. With his family, Abdul Nasser Lajkar has made it from Gaza City. He says he had no choice.
It doesn't matter if you're in Gaza or Khan Yunis or anywhere else. There's no safe place. There's no place that is immune from the bombing. Gaza is being bombed, Nusrat's being bombed, Khan Yunis is being bombed. That's why we're sitting on the street.
Showing us shrapnel marks on his car, he says the journey south was horrendous as Israel attacked.
We saw a lot of destruction. They hit a car in front of us and we saw legs and hands on top of the car. They all became like when you slaughter an animal, how you cut them up into pieces. That's what happened to the occupants of the car. We got out of our car and we could not comprehend what we were seeing.
The Israeli military is determined to succeed. Hamas and its militias are determined to fight. Civilians are stuck. There is nowhere to run and nowhere to hide in Gaza. Stuart Ramsey, Sky News in southern Israel.
Well, as Israeli troops and armour continue to move into Gaza, one Israeli soldier is out tonight. Private Ori Magadish was freed after a ground operation, that's according to the Israeli Defense Force, while she recovers with her family. A video of 3 more hostages has been released by Hamas. A friend of one of them told Sky News she looked sad, but seeing her made them hopeful. Cordelia Lynch reports now from Israel.
Back in the arms of her grandmother, Private Uri Magadish, freed by Israeli troops in a ground operation. It is, though, a pendulum of torment, and it swung again with a video released by Hamas showing 3 hostages, one taking aim at Israel's Prime Minister. He called it cruel propaganda. For Cherie, a friend of Elena Tripanov, it is tempered relief.
So she didn't speak. She was on the right side. You can tell that she's sad, which is to be expected, but she looks healthy. So we're hopeful.
There are the mechanics of war and diplomacy, but here it's souls they once celebrated.
They are beloved grandmother, fathers, sisters, and children. Real people with beating hearts waiting to be free.
Some are waiting for accountability.
Do you think Benjamin Netanyahu bears some responsibility?
No doubt, no doubt. There are many people in his government that for them peace is not first priority.
This square is home to hope and despair, faith and frustration. It is evidence, 3 weeks on, of the nuance that still exists, but is perhaps increasingly being lost in the fault lines of fury.
The leadership also needs to try and stop any conflict erupting internally.
How much responsibility do you think the Prime Minister needs to personally accept for the lapse in security that led to the October the 7th attacks? And do you acknowledge that the threat from Hamas was downplayed?
everybody's going to ask a lot of questions. I have a lot of questions myself, and everybody's going to have to give a lot of answers. But I think to actually have that conversation now is not going to help us prosecute the war.
As they strategize, Shani Luke's family mourns. Paraded semi-naked on the back of a truck, now confirmed dead by the discovery of her skull. The awful fate of one captive and a government under pressure to rescue many more.
And Cordelia is with me now. You attended the Netanyahu news conference and he was pretty clear, no ceasefire.
Yeah, I think it was very striking, both in his demeanour and in his language. There was defiance there, rejecting this notion of a ceasefire, something that Hamas has said, if it is given, then they will look to release those hostages. So I think some of Netanyahu's words there will cause concern amongst some of the families that I've spoken to who are still holding vigil in Tel Aviv, desperate, of course, to bring their loved ones home. I think what we hear from the words he's using, invoking the Bible and talking about this sort of victory against barbarism, rejecting the idea that he will resign, and also imploring others to take on this sort of axis of evil between Iran and Hamas, as he describes it. I think he's trying to make clear to the global community he's not going to be lectured by anyone. We've heard a lot of discussion around these kind of backroom talks with America, clearly a lot of hope and expectation in the international community. They will be a moderating voice, and I was reassured by his team that he is speaking regularly, every other day in fact, to Joe Biden. There could, though, Mark, still be room for a pause, a kind of brief cessation in hostilities. And I think that is what some of the families are holding out hope for, that might give them some room, some scope to bring their loved ones back, but no guarantees. And I think he came out on the back of the news of a freed hostage today, wanting to tell everyone he's not willing to back down.
OK, Cordelia, thanks very much indeed. Now, the mob which descended on a Russian airport saying they were searching for Jews were inspired by Western agents based in Ukraine, President Putin claimed today. One rabbi and critic, though, told Sky News the actions of Russia's leader, including hosting a delegation from Hamas, could have been seen as a sign that a hunting season was now on. Our Moscow correspondent Diana Magnay has this report.
It is a terrifying scene, an anti-Jewish pogrom in the land where that word came from. A mob rushing through an airport in Dagestan in Russia's North Caucasus after a plane touched down from Tel Aviv. Bursting their way through airport control, they say they're looking for Jews. Where are they? They yell. Not here, they're told. And so they pour out onto the airport tarmac. The passengers disembarking, unsure what to do or what's happening. Quickly, everyone back on board, the steward says. This is not a good look for Vladimir Putin and his proclamations of order or of a multi-faith, multi-ethnic state. And no surprises here, he was quick to blame the West.
The events in Makhachkala last night were inspired, among other things, through social networks, not least from the territory of Ukraine by the hands of agents of Western intelligence services.
Vladimir Putin has hedged his bets around the current crisis in the Middle East. Critics point to rising anti-Semitism, which they say is state-led.
Last week, the Russian Foreign Ministry received on a high-level Hamas delegation. You also see President Putin meeting with religious leaders in Russia, and he's talking about the Middle East and the war, and he does not condemn the massacre by Hamas. So this could have been also seen as a sign by some interested parties that the hunting season against the Jews is on.
Dagestan is predominantly Muslim and historically restive. There is a small Jewish community, though, which has lived here in peace for over 1,000 years. And now they are looking to leave. Diana Magnay, Sky News.
Two senior MPs have been sanctioned by their parties tonight over their views on the war between Israel and Hamas. A Conservative MP was sacked after calling for a permanent break in hostilities, and a Labour MP has been suspended over comments he made at a pro-Palestine rally. Deputy Political Editor Sam Coates is at Westminster. Good evening, Sam. So this conflict leading to considerable strains in politics at home.
That's right, Mark. It has been an important day here in Westminster because we're seeing the first proper pressure on that cross-party consensus that we've had for the last 3 or so weeks behind the position on Israel and Hamas. Earlier today, the Prime Minister sacked one of the most junior members of his government, Paul Bristow, after he called for a permanent ceasefire. Rishi Sunak has judged that that is incompatible with Britain standing shoulder to shoulder with Israel. But Keir Starmer is taking a slightly different approach. He too believes that a permanent ceasefire is the wrong course of action, but he has decided to leave in their jobs the dozen or so frontbenchers in the Labour Party who have also publicly called for a ceasefire. Instead, the Labour leader has decided to draw the line in a different place. Tonight, he suspended the whip from a left-wing Labour MP, Andy MacDonald, after MacDonald on Saturday used the phrase "the river to the sea" at a protest. Now, the Labour leaders' team see just the use of that phrase as something that upsets the Jewish community, doesn't want to unpick some of the hard work that he's done combating anti-Semitism. But Andy MacDonald, quite clear that if you read the whole sentence that he said, he was calling for peace, and he says there's no other way of reading what he said. And there's a big backlash on the right, on the left of the Labour Party tonight about the decision to suspend the whip. There is difficulties for the Labour Party everywhere. Earlier today, Home Secretary Suella Braverman, she talked about hate marches, those weekly Palestinian marches. Labour responding to that no doubt provocative act, talking simply about careless rhetoric. Is this pragmatism from the Labour Party? Is it weakness? It all depends on whether Keir Starmer can hold the line in the coming days. We shall see.
OK, Sam, thanks very much indeed. Well, as the war goes on, the situation gets increasingly desperate for the people living in Gaza. As we've heard, Israel has repeatedly called for residents to head south to what they describe as safe zones. North of England correspondent Inzamam Rashid has been speaking to a British teacher trapped inside Gaza who just wants to get out.
Every single day we are bombarded with bombs, and each bomb that we hear we think, who did that bomb kill?
Trapped inside Gaza with no idea when she'll even have a chance to leave. Zainab, a school teacher from Manchester, and 10 members of her family are pleading for help. Internet and phone signal is patchy, communication is limited, and she says even speaking to me like this is incredibly risky.
It's very scary. Everyone just tries to do their best to stay together. I don't want to go into detail over the phone, but it's devastating.
Like many foreign nationals stuck inside Gaza, Zainab and her family made their way to the Rafah border in hope it would open. But despite several attempts, they just can't get through. And with supplies now running out, the situation is desperate. The British authorities are in touch, but Zainab says their help is limited and frustrating. She shares these messages. Hi Zainab, how are you doing for food and water? Do you have any injuries? We don't have much, she says. We barely eat and drink as there's nothing left. Water is a luxury that we are not privy to. I'm really sorry. We are really trying to get people out of Gaza through the Rafah border, but we aren't hearing anything about when it will open. But we are doing our best to push them to open it. Back in Manchester, and Zainab's mum can only wait for her daughter to return.
My biggest fear is that they're going to get hurt or injured or worse. And the more time that passes, the bigger the likelihood that will happen.
The Foreign Office told us that the safety of British nationals remains our top priority. We are working closely with Egypt and Israel to ensure all British nationals who want to leave Gaza can. But Zainab is scared. She wants to be back with her family in the UK. Instead, she has no idea when she can escape life in a war zone. Inzamam Rashid, Sky News, Manchester.
And that is about it from Jerusalem tonight. Now back to Anna in London.
Mark, thank you. Well, it is a phrase reminiscent of when Boris Johnson allegedly said at the height of the COVID pandemic, "Let the bodies pile high." The then Prime Minister recorded in a note from a former private secretary asking why the government was destroying the economy for people who will die anyway soon. Well, the evidence came as those around Boris Johnson during the pandemic started giving evidence to the COVID inquiry. One witness tomorrow will be his former Chief of Staff, Dominic Cummings. Our political correspondent, Tamara Cohen, reports.
Boris Johnson's right-hand man, at his side as the key decisions of the pandemic were made. And he admits there were glaring holes.
The machine was not properly prepared for the scale of the crisis it was about to face.
Martin Reynolds, sitting here with Boris Johnson, shot to public attention during the Partygate scandal because of this email inviting dozens of Downing Street staff to gather in the garden and bring their own booze. Today, an apology.
I think I would first like to say how deeply sorry I am for my part in those events and for the email message which went out that day. And I'd like to apologise unreservedly to the families of all those who suffered during COVID.
Today's evidence to the inquiry paints a picture of dysfunction and personality clashes at the top of government. And then there's the question of how lockdown decisions were made, with advisers accused of using secretive WhatsApp groups to make the critical calls. Mr. Reynolds was on a WhatsApp group with Boris Johnson and a small group of the most senior aides. He was asked why, just weeks before this public inquiry was announced, he decided to turn on disappearing mode so the messages would vanish after 7 days.
I don't believe it was intended to prevent the inquiry from having sight of this. It could, for example, have been because I was worried of someone screenshotting or using some of the exchanges and leaking them.
Some newly released messages and diary entries give a sense of the turmoil. Top civil servant Simon Case said the government looked like a tragic joke, and Boris Johnson cannot lead. Patrick Vallance, the chief scientific advisor, called the Prime Minister completely inconsistent. Tonight, families of those bereaved by COVID held a vigil at Barnard Castle, the town notoriously visited by Dominic Cummings in defiance of lockdown rules. We'll hear from him tomorrow, and later this week, NHS leaders on the consequences of political decisions. Tamara Cohen, Sky News.
The initial post-mortem examination results for the actor Matthew Perry, who died over the weekend, are inconclusive, with the cause of death yet to be determined. The actor, best known for his role as Chandler Bing in Friends, was found dead at his home in Los Angeles. While a US correspondent, Martha Kellner, is in Los Angeles for us tonight. And Martha, so no firm conclusion then over how Matthew Perry died, and no public condolences yet from his Friends co-stars.
That's right, Anna. The medical examiner has deferred the cause of Matthew Perry's death pending further examinations. They've ordered a toxicology report which will determine whether he had any drugs or alcohol in his system at the time of his death. Those tests could take 3 to 4 months to be returned. Matthew Perry, of course, documented himself his struggles with drugs and alcohol. More information too coming to light about how he spent his final hours. We know that on the morning of the day he died, he played pickleball for around an hour. That was something he did 4 to 5 times a week, according to his instructor, something that helped with his recovery. We know as well that he spent much of that final day with his assistant left his house briefly to run some errands and returned to find him unresponsive in that hot tub. It was them who made that 911 call to emergency services. As you say, tributes continuing online to Matthew Perry. Salma Hayek, notably his co-star in Fools Rush In, the film Fools Rush In, said the pair shared a special bond. His occasional Friends co-star Ben Stiller saying that Matthew Perry created a comedic rhythm that became iconic. Many fans, though, still waiting to hear from those 5 core cast members of Friends. We're told that they may well be preparing a joint statement.
In LA, thank you. King Charles has landed in Kenya tonight for his first trip as monarch to Africa. He's expected while there to acknowledge what he'll call painful aspects of the country's shared history with the UK. And for one family, that history is especially painful. Agnes Wanjiru was murdered 11 years ago by an inquest found 1 or more British soldiers. And her family have a message for the King, as our Africa correspondent Yusra El-Bahir reports.
Your Majesty King Charles, in your visit to Kenya, I extend my heartfelt invitation to meet us, the family of Agnes Wanjiru.
Agnes Wanjiru was murdered in March 2012. An inquest found that she was killed by 1 or more British soldiers, and her niece is addressing their commander-in-chief.
Your Majesty, we ask you that you come to our aid by bringing attention and urgency to the case of Agnes Wanjiru's murder. Our family needs justice, our family needs closure. Your Majesty, please do the right thing.
An appeal made ahead of the royal visit to Kenya, but a trip to see Agnes's surviving family is not on the King's schedule. Over 11 years ago, the body of 21-year-old Agnes was found in the septic tank of this hotel. Witnesses said they saw her go into the hotel with 2 uniformed British soldiers. Her sister Rose has been looking after her daughter Stacey, who was 5 months old when she died.
Since the day Stacey was left behind, she's now 12 years old. It's been a difficult few years, especially when she was a child.
Rose was a key complainant in the 2019 inquest that suggested there was a cover-up of her sister's murder. The British government maintains that the jurisdiction for the investigation lies with the Kenya Police Service. But that hasn't quelled rising discontent. This protest was organised in anticipation of King Charles's visit by people who describe themselves as victims of the British Army in Kenya.
The people of Loldaiga, Agnes Wanjiru family, they need to be compensated. All the soldiers who committed these heinous crimes be brought to Kenya for trial. That is our bare minimum request to His Majesty the King.
As the King takes his first African trip as monarch to Kenya, the stakes are high. Not for its political symbolism, but for the deep wounds of the past it's opened. Yusra El-Bahir, Sky News.
Now, the ground is already saturated in many parts of the country thanks to Storm Babette and other heavy autumn rainfall. Now, the latest named storm, Kieran, is moving towards the UK, and it could be a nasty one, according to the Met Office. A yellow weather warning for heavy rain is currently in place for parts of Northern Ireland, which could last until Thursday. An amber warning has also been issued for much of its southeast, with potential for flooding until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Well, the weather is expected to worsen as the week progresses, with strong winds and heavy rain on the south coast of England, in much of Wales and again in parts of Northern Ireland. Our correspondent Stephen Murphy has this report.
It was a wet weekend in many parts of the UK, and the bad news is that more of the same is to follow in the days ahead. The seaside resort of Bognor Regis was badly affected by the heavy rain. A caravan park submerged. The car park of the local Tesco completely flooded as West Sussex Fire and Rescue Service battled to keep the waters from an electrical substation. In Devon, a family-run pub collapsed following torrential rain.
It's the impact on all my staff. I employ 20 full and part-time. It's my livelihood, it's my son and his family's livelihood, and all the people that had booked their celebrations for Christmas that we're having to cancel. It's just devastating.
In Northern Ireland, there was severe traffic disruption with many roads closed by flooding. There are multiple rain warnings in place for Northern Ireland for the week ahead, including an amber rain warning, the second highest level. The Met Office is warning of between 25 and 50 millimetres of rain falling. And the problem is a lot of that will be falling on already saturated land, which greatly increases the risk of flooding and further disruption. And then there's Ciarán. The third named storm of the season arrives in the UK on Wednesday into Thursday amid a flurry of yellow warnings, bringing heavy, persistent rain and forecasted gusts of up to 80 miles per hour.
We may need to escalate at least portions of the warning to amber, and red isn't out of the question. This is an exceptionally deep area of low pressure that's coming towards us. In fact, it could be record-breaking.
It promises to be a wet and windy few days for many parts of the country, including areas already struggling to deal with the fallout from Storm Babette. Stephen Murphy, Sky News.
Well, that was Sky News at 10. Coming up, we'll take a first look at tomorrow's newspapers in the press preview. Tonight, we're joined by the policy and politics correspondent at the New Statesman, Zoe Grinefeld, and the political editor of The Sun, Harry Cole. And the incoming storm Ciarán is among the stories on the front pages. The Metro, they're hailing what it calls the miracle of a couple saved from the storm. Back with all of that in just a moment. Well, this is Sky News. In just a moment, the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. First, though, our top stories this evening. Israel's Prime Minister has ruled out any ceasefire or humanitarian pause in Gaza, claiming such action would constitute surrender to Hamas. Well, Israel says its ground forces have rescued a female soldier being held in Gaza as Hamas releases images showing three other civilian hostages still in captivity. And Boris Johnson's former top aide has said he's deeply sorry for an email encouraging Downing Street staff to bring your own booze to a gathering during lockdown. Let's just bring you a statement we have now received about Matthew Perry on behalf of the four other members of the Friends cast: Jennifer Aniston, Courtney Cox, Lisa Kudrow and Matt LeBlanc and David Schwimmer, saying we're all so utterly devastated by the loss of Matthew. We were more than just castmates, we are a family. There is so much to say, but right now we're going to take a moment to grieve and process this unfathomable loss. In time, we will say more as and when we're able. For now, our thoughts and our love are with Matty's family, his friends, and everyone who loved him around the world. We were reflecting a short time ago with our correspondent in Los Angeles, Martha Kellner, that there had been no statement, the suggestion that they were to bring in a joint statement, and there it is, paying their tributes to Matthew Perry, utterly devastated by his loss. Well, hello there, watching the press preview, a first look at what is on the front pages. Time to see what's making the headlines with the policy and politics correspondent at the New Statesman, Zoe Grunewald, and the political editor at The Sun, Harry Cole. Welcome to both of you, with us from now until just before midnight. So to the front pages, as ever, let's check those out. The Metro leading with the headline, saved from the storm, alongside a picture of a couple narrowly avoiding being swept out to sea in Yorkshire as Tom Kieran heads for the UK. The Financial Times features an image of the Israeli soldier who had been freed by Israeli Defence Forces. That photo is also on the front page of The Eye, but the paper leads with a story from the COVID inquiry, as top government advisers said Boris Johnson made it impossible for the country to tackle COVID. The Guardian leading with the Israeli Prime Minister ruling out a ceasefire in Gaza while declaring that this is a time for war. Front page of the Daily Star asks whether Uranus could be the key to helping scientists find aliens. The Telegraph also focusing on the soldier freed by Israel during an IDF raid in Gaza. Daily Mail, pawns of the terrorists there, picturing the 3 hostages featured in that Hamas video. And the Daily Mirror featuring a picture of Boris Johnson alongside the headline "Tragic Joke," referencing the evidence given today by his former advisor at the COVID inquiry. Well, a reminder, by scanning the QR code you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us and listen to our guests. So let's head straight to Zoe and Harry. Welcome to both of you. Shall we start with the very latest from the war? The Guardian, the Israeli Prime Minister ruling out a ceasefire, declaring this is a time for war. Obviously, many are demanding a ceasefire. We'll come to what the politicians in the UK have said about that. And picturing the Israeli soldier who was freed, fascinatingly, which pits, in a sense, the hostages' families once again against this ground offensive in some respects, or at least against the airstrikes, Harry.
Well, I think we don't know if I don't think we think she was freed. I think she was rescued is the crucial thing, and I think that actually might give some serious hope to the 200 other families, the odd families that are waiting for any sign of whether their loved ones are alive and whether there's any hope of getting them back. Yes, the ground offensive now has really begun to have started. Israeli tanks are quite far into the Gaza Strip in a way that they haven't been for so far in the last 3 weeks. This is really very much on now, it feels like. All the footage that's coming out of Gaza as the phones go back on, as the communications come back on, shows that the Israelis are quite far into the Strip. At the same time, you've got this remarkable picture of this young woman who'd been rescued. I imagine a conscript. She doesn't look a day over 20 years old. Like, it is a phenomenal picture. At the same time, you've got the horror of the Hamas parade of 3 other women hostages being held. They weren't soldiers. She wasn't. They weren't soldiers. They were civilians. And you've just got a really stark contrast tonight between what Netanyahu is saying of why they must push on, why they must do what they do, and you've got the despair of of some families seeing their loved ones still in capture, and the utter joy on the faces of the rescued soldier.
Yeah, same photograph on the front page of the Financial Times as well. Israel rescues, as you put it, their first hostage. You know, the details of that eventually will be fascinating. But what about that issue of the ceasefire and, you know, the calls in this country by some who are asking for a ceasefire and finding, in a sense, they're being politically punished for that?
Yeah, so we know that Netanyahu has ruled out a ceasefire, as have Hamas. Both of them feel that this conflict needs to continue. They both have demands that the other side obviously aren't going to acquiesce to. And then, of course, we're seeing play out on the political field here in the UK, a number of MPs calling for a ceasefire, a number of members of the front bench have publicly called for a ceasefire. We also have prominent Labour politicians such as Andy Burnham, such as Sadiq Khan, and, of course, Conservative frontbencher as well, Conservative PPS. So we can see that actually this crosses kind of political lines as well. And really what it is about is trying to put an end to the suffering of people on both sides and being able to get some of those humanitarian supplies into Gaza and stopping the kind of indiscriminate killing of so many people who are trapped there.
There is there's a consensus now between the two frontbenchers of Labour and the government of humanitarian pauses. Quite a woolly term. No one's really actually defined whether that means minutes, hours, days, weeks. No one's quite got that. It's actually a fig leaf. It's a fig leaf for people to hide behind, actually, to make them sound like they're playing to both being the resolute defender of Israel and playing to the sort of audiences who are calling for a ceasefire. But I think you've got to really, strip down into what a ceasefire actually means. If Israel laid down their arms tomorrow, terrorists would swarm over their border and slit their throats and murder their wives and burn their babies again. That is what it means. Hamas are not going to respect a ceasefire. They have been firing rockets non-stop on Israel for years, since 2007. Now, if Israel laid out, if Hamas laid down their arms, there would be peace. That is what would happen. And so this idea that actually the onus is on Israel to be the ones that pause this, I think is deeply, deeply unfair.
Yes, at the very least, there may not be another Gaza incursion, but there might be time to regroup, which is what the argument against it is for many. The United Nations discussing it once again. The concern is that humanitarian aid is being overrun now. Civil society breaking down in Gaza, specifically after the blackout, if you like, of communications, which seems to be being restored. So, you know, the pressure is on for humanitarian help. The incursion, it seems, may have split Gaza now. How people are then allowed to move south to southern Gaza becomes trickier for them, doesn't it? So, we're watching this in real time, but with questions still remaining.
It really is a humanitarian disaster. You know, I think it's something like one child is killed every 10 minutes in Gaza. We know the population is particularly young. We know it's particularly vulnerable. When you compare the sort of resources that Gaza have with the resources of the Israelis, you know, there really isn't anywhere for these civilians to hide or to shelter from. And we know that they've not been able to leave the country. They've not had access to the supplies they need. So it's really tragic to watch this happen, play out in real time. And of course, you know, Israel will say it has a right to defend itself. It needs to go in there and get the hostages back. But the real question is, how does this end? And, you know, the worry is, will Gaza and the people of Gaza be flattened alongside this? So the question is how this can be done kind of proportionately, how Israel can get back its hostages.
What is a proportionate response to slitting people's throats in their sleep on a Saturday morning and putting babies in ovens and burning corpses and tying people together and shooting them with one bullet through the same two heads? What is a proportionate... There is no proportionate response to that. That's the point.
I don't think that's
the catch-22, is who is anyone? Who is the UN? Who is Andy, whatever his name, some Labour backbencher? Who is some junior PPS from the Tory, some bag carrier from the Tory party, to tell anyone who's just been through what Israel has been through, and has been through, really, frankly, for decades, of what is a proportionate response? We have no right to lecture this country on what they should be able to do.
I think everyone sensible condemns the actions of Hamas, absolutely. You know, it's absolutely appalling, that terrorist attack. Of course. But, you know, there are innocent people living in Palestine. As I said, many of them, almost half the population, are children. And, you know, war in any context has to be within the bounds of international law. And that means that civilians are given supplies, you know, hospitals are protected. And unfortunately, as you say, part of Hamas's strategy is to hide within the civilian population.
That's the grim catch-22. Is actually how do you free a population that's also repressed by Hamas when Hamas is living amongst them?
Yeah.
Well, once again, the picture of this young soldier, this young private, Ori Megadish, pictured on the front page of the Daily Telegraph. If we take a look at that as well. Israel frees kidnapped soldier in Gaza raid. Netanyahu's tanks roll into the main city for the first time as Hamas releases videos of more hostages. And certainly we had footage today of an Israeli tank appearing to fire on a car just south of Gaza City, which, as you've suggested, shows how far they've pushed in this incursion so far.
Yeah, those pictures are verified, I think, by multiple international media outlets, finally by geolocators tonight. Yeah, we don't know who was in the car, but it does show that quite how far they are.
The journalist suggests a whole family is in it, the journalist who filmed it, but
again,
some distance away.
Some distance away, but also we don't know. That is the issue. But this is the way that we see a war now. Can you imagine if conflicts of the past had been live streamed on social media and mobile phones and cameras in the way that they do now? Would we ever have been able to fight the Second World War? I don't think we probably would, because there would have been, it's a very strange world we're living in, where there's sort of war is through. Even the sort of Gulf Wars of the 90s and the 2000s, they had embedded journalists with them. They didn't have everyone, citizen journalists everywhere, filming everything. It's a really remarkable way that everything, suddenly, every micro decision and every single tiny thing is sort of played out live on social media with people picking sides. It creates a really strange atmosphere of how a conflict could possibly be resolved when the global community is, sort of almost horribly watching it like it's, a box set.
OK, lots more still to come in the next part of our programme, including what or how Boris Johnson was described in the COVID inquiry, and why Germany could cost up to 6,000 jobs in the UK. Harry Cole on the name there. We'll have that just a moment as well.
My most memorable story was, and still is, the disappearance of Madeleine McCann.
Please give our little girl back.
I can't undo what's happened, but I can help explain it.
I'm Katie Spencer and I'm Sky News' arts and entertainment correspondent.
Well, welcome back. You are watching the press preview with me once again, the policy and politics correspondent at the New Statesman, Zoe Grunewald, and the political editor of The Sun, Harry Cole. Welcome back to both of you. So to the COVID inquiry, hearing from the top apparatchiks, if you like, at Downing Street during this time. And goodness me, what we learned. And some excoriating criticism, has to be said, against the former Prime Minister, Harry.
Yeah, there's an amazing part of some of the WhatsApp evidence that was shown today at the COVID inquiry. And we're getting into the really sort of box office bits of this. It's the what happened in those days, those awful days in March, where the sort of scenes of Italy were creeping closer and closer to our shores. And there's this brilliant bit where it goes, do you reckon any of this is going to be up in a public inquiry at some point and we should be careful about what we say? And they'll go, yeah, we should be careful about what we say. And then proceed to spend the next 2 years just slagging each other off. It is phenomenal. And actually, Simon Case, who's the most senior Mandarin in the country at the time, he wasn't necessarily, I think, when he said some of these particularly sassy comments about Boris Johnson, but he was right in the heart of the COVID response, essentially saying that the Prime Minister was unable to lead. He was a shopping trolley veering all over the shop, and at some point,
let it rip one day.
Let it rip one day, and it's a machine. He's basically said he's the sort of master of government. He's a man that's written great doctorates about the art of government and the workings of Whitehall. And actually, he was saying it's not actually that hard, but you've got to be able to give clear, decisive messages. And it's just sorts of frustrations that have come out at that time. Did we learn anything massively new that we didn't already kind of suspect? And no, I don't think so. But my God, when they say that you don't want to see how the sausages are made, this is what they're talking about.
And the idea is that Boris Johnson kind of favoured more of a Swedish response. He's a libertarian, doesn't really want to stop anybody doing something. And then it was kind of forced upon him, effectively. And he was still fighting it all the way through. You got this impression, didn't you, really?
I think part of Johnson's approach throughout government was to really do a lot of policy that he thought would make him popular. And things like lockdowns clearly don't make him popular with the country or backbenchers. But it soon became clear that actually that was what other countries were doing, Italy, France, Spain, and that he had to follow suit. But yeah, I mean, it's been an extraordinary day, and the COVID inquiry just kind of keeps on giving in terms of shocking psychodrama between politicians. And what is a bit of a shame is obviously one of the things that we do need to touch on this is how we can prevent, many more deaths when there is ultimately another pandemic. And although it is, it's interesting and it's scandalous to hear about how government was working at this time, it's also really sad. There are the bereaved families here, and we need to know exactly where the mistakes were made and how they can be prevented for next time.
But also, I mean, we've got to look at the fact, and I think what a slight issue I have with the line of questioning that we've seen so far, and I've watched and listened to quite a bit of this now, is they sort of seem to have made up their mind about what the right thing to do was already, and they're actually sort of just exposing all the times that everyone didn't go against what has been the established groupthink that lockdown good, economy go to hell. And actually now we're living through the long tail of the COVID lockdown, and the fact that, a lot of the people weren't just saying, let's let them die for the sake of it. They're saying, we are going to crash our country into an economic recession, the likes of it has never been seen. Are we sure? Do we do this? And I do wonder whether actually, in the long run, given now what we know about lockdown, now what we know about Sweden, and now what we know about other countries that didn't go into quite the same depths of shutdown that we did, and actually had a fairly similar outcome on the results of COVID, actually maybe that debate was the right thing to do.
Front page of the FT as well. Similar, Johnson changed direction every day as the crisis mounted. Quick 30 seconds on your story if you don't... Well, that's not very good policy, is it? You can't read that one at all. Good job, we're moving on. Anyway, to the Sun. Very quickly, Germans to cost the UK 6,000 jet jobs.
Big old fight going on at the moment. We are trying to sell Saudis 48 of our Typhoon fighters, which we've co-built with Germany. Germany is saying, no, they're in a coalition with the Greens that don't want to sell them to the Saudis because they're possibly used in Yemen. What that does actually mean is that basically BAE have told ministers that means that our Typhoon production in this country is going to go bust. It could be economically unviable, and that's a £15 billion blow that's going to go to France. So another win for Brexit.
The Metro just quickly safe from the storm. Miracle as Kieran heads for the UK. Zoe and Harry, we'll see you soon. But for now, let's check out the weather.
Warm memories wherever you go. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Well, Storm Ciarán will certainly bring the risk of damaging winds to the south on Thursday, along with widespread heavy rain. Before then, plenty of rain around, which may lead to further flooding and disruption. Rainfall warnings issued with an amber covering parts of Northern Ireland until 9 tomorrow morning. The hills there could see up to 100 millimetres. Tuesday, starting largely dry off chilly in places. More rain around, heavy. Northern Ireland, Wales and an area from Lancashire and Merseyside down to Kent look most at risk. Northern Ireland will see the rain easing through the morning. More of northern England turning cloudy and wet. Wales, central and southern England will keep the risk of showers.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
The 5 of us have made it out of the car.
Welcome to Backstage, the film and TV podcast.